Exposed. Battlefield Z. By Chris Lowry. Copyright 2020. Grand Ozarks Media. All rights reserved. Contact chrislowrybooks@gmail.com. Exposed. I'm scared. Buck Atkins stared at the pixelated screen on the company laptop and ran his finger across the shape of her face. I know, baby, he said as he glanced around to see who might be listening. I am too. No, Buck, I'm scared for real. Things are going crazy around here. She cradled their 6-year-old daughter in her lap. The little girl reached out one finger and touched the camera on their computer, blocking the view for a moment. He heard Lucy whisper an admonishment and pull her hand away. Daddy. The girl squealed in delight. You're doing a good job shielding her from it, he said and ran a hand across his shaved head. Someone broke into the neighbors last night. Lucy leaned closer to the computer, making her face larger. Buck noticed how huge her eyes were, the dark purple circles underneath indicating how little sleep she had been getting. They shot somebody and the police won't come get them. Shot who? It's happening up and down the street, Lucy said. These, I don't know, gangs or something are breaking into people's houses and taking all of their food and stuff. Who got shot? Buck grabbed the monitor as if holding it could get her to focus and answer his question. Our neighbor, she said. I've got the door bolted, but I don't think it's enough. Buck, I'm scared. Lucy cradled their daughter in her arms and squeezed her tight. Don't cry, Mommy. Buck swiped at the corner of his own eye. Look, I'll go talk to my CO, he said. I'll tell him I've got to get to you. He'll understand. But what about tonight? Lucy stared into the screen, huge eyes painted with fear drilling into him. Block the doors, he said. With what? Furniture, anything. Go get some boards from the garage and drill them across the windows. Lucy shook her head, but she didn't say no. Just make it harder for them to get in, he continued. They'll try, and if they can't make it, they'll go to the next easier house. And then I'll be there. When? As soon as I can, he said. My allotment's up, babe. Buck, she said. I know you're scared. I know it. And if they start trying to get into the house, go hide in the attic. Pull the stairs up after you. Matter of fact, go make a quick picnic you can put up there now, you know, just in case. A picnic. Charlotte squirmed in her mother's arms. Help her, Charlie, Buck said as the soldier behind him began punching him on the shoulder. He was ready for his time on the screen to check in with his loved ones. Go pick out some good yummy snacks Mommy can put in the attic, Buck said as he stood up and swiped at the private behind him. Block the doors, get some blankets, some books, some stuff, just get the attic ready to hide in, okay babe? The monitor went black before she could answer. Shit, Buck cursed. He hoped she would do it as he gathered his rifle and pack and went to see his CO. The man would understand. Chapter 2. Denied. But sir. The man behind the folding table covered with folders, forms and paper stood and scraped it across the bare concrete floor with his thighs. The command tent was tight, crammed with tables on 3 sides that doubled as desks, the canvas walls covered with maps of the city. Captain Jeter Rush bullied his way into the narrow space where Buck Atkins stood at attention. I said you can't abandon your post, he put his hand on the .45 strap to his waist. We're under strict orders to maintain our position, so if you go AWOL, I'll have you shot for desertion. Hell, Private, I'll pull the fucking trigger myself. Buck stared past him, focused on a paper printout tacked to the wall. It was covered with red circles that spread out, whole sections of the cities blacked out. Sir, Buck said. We're a critical block in this chain, you understand, Rush said. They were inches apart, and Buck could smell the stale odor of unwashed body and fear in the tight confines of the tent. Our role is to maintain this post, stay in this position and contain the virus outbreak in that line, he pointed. Yes sir, but my wife. We all have wives, Rush snapped. You don't think I want to go home and protect mine from this madness? You think every soldier out there doesn't want to go keep their family safe? What makes you think you're so fucking special? Buck cleared his throat. She's all I've got. Rush pushed the desk back into position to get a clear line to one of the maps on the wall. It was of the United States and it looked like no map Buck had ever seen. Atkins, Rush made an effort to sound reasonable as he tapped on black spots on the map. We're in a war and we're losing. This virus, this plague, whatever it is, it's killing us faster than we can get ahead of it. He turned back to the soldier. Our job is to keep it behind that line. Your job is to stand on that wall until I relieve you, you got me? Now get out of my office and get your ass to your post. Buck snapped off a salute and did an about face. He marched out of the tent set in the heart of the fob set up in the parking lot of a big box convenience store. He stared across the canvas tent tops that rippled in the breeze to the 12-foot hurricane fence stacked with Army-issue green sandbags. The fencing surrounded their position and stretched as far as he could see in either direction, locking off the town they were ordered to hold. He strapped his helmet onto his head and marched toward the guard post set in the middle of the blocked roadway leading into town. How did it go? Roscoe Jenkins asked as he pushed into the narrow opening and leaned against the sandbag wall. How do you think? Told you, the dark-skinned soldier laughed without mirth. Captain's a son of bitch. He wants us all to die here. Got some death wish or something? Jenkins leaned against the 6-foot wall and peered over the edge. The stretch of road in front of them was empty, but 300 yards further up, he could see people milling around on the other side of a second fence that surrounded the town. What are they doing? Buck stepped up on the single sandbag ledge on the bottom of the wall so he could look too. Nothing, Jenkins grunted. Just moving around like they always do. Buck lifted up his rifle and sighted down the barrel. 300 yards was nothing, he thought. If he had a scope, he could make out details, but at this range, they were just shapes, colors, movement. He could tell they weren't normal though. Normal people would grip the far fence and beg to be let out. That's just what they had done 3 weeks ago when the army put it up. Normal people would complain, would state their rights, would threaten to contact their congressman. They would call the police or in some cases, climb the fence or try to run through it. Snipers in the fob put a quick stop to those thoughts with a few well-placed rounds. Now, the people who were left, if they were still people, shuffled and moved with jerky motions, tracked the movement of the soldiers outside the line, and massed at the fences until some noise or the wind or a leaf fluttering in the breeze distracted them. You gonna shoot them all? I would if it could get us out of here. Roscoe turned around and slid down the wall. Brother, I wanna go home too. This here shit got me worried about my mama and my brothers. You think your wife's gonna be okay? Buck slid down next to him, rested his rifle across his lap. I don't know, he sighed. She said people were breaking in and shooting people. Shit, brother. I know. I told her to block the door and hide in the attic. Roscoe glanced up the narrow passageway created by the sandbags. I've been talking to a couple other guys, he said as he lowered his voice. We don't think this Alamo bullshit is gonna work for us. Buck nodded. You know what happened at the Alamo, right? Roscoe asked. Yep. Everybody died. Texas heroes. Yeah, well they might have been heroes, but they were dead heroes. You know what a dead man can do for your wife and kid? Buck lowered his head and didn't answer. Damn sure can't keep him safe. Hell, now, a dead hero can come back and bite their ass, infect them and shit. I know, Buck muttered. Since a bunch of us don't want to play hero anymore, up here where folks don't matter to us personal, you know. We think it's time to go help our own people. Buck glanced up at him. Rush said he'd shoot deserters. Fuck him, Roscoe whispered. You want to stay here and watch those things walk around or you want to go keep your family safe? Buck played with the ridges on his rifle, tracing the lines with the tip of his grungy finger. It'd be like a prison break, he said. I mean, if we're just talking about it. We can't breach the perimeter without exposing our platoon to a lot of danger. And we're as trapped in here as they are in there. Roscoe grunted again. Been thinking on that a lot, actually. They do a helicopter drop to bring us supplies, right? Buck snorted. We can't steal a helicopter. Ain't planning to steal nothing. Roscoe patted his rifle and pack. Get us some MREs, take what we have and slip out the back jack, while everyone else is watching that helo drop. Buck sat up a little straighter. The supply drop was the highlight of the week. Most of their time in the fob was spent watching activity on the far side of the fence, and there hadn't been much since the first attempts at a breakout 3 weeks ago. The helo had visited 3 times, twice with supplies, and once with a VIP 1-star who wanted a boots-on-the-ground update. When the chopper hovered over the base, it was loud, it was anticipated, and now that he thought about it, gave them a 1-hour window where all eyes were looking elsewhere. We're still just talking about it, he told Roscoe. Not planning anything, just discussing. But if someone pulled a rabbit during the drop, Which way would they go? Roscoe considered it for a few moments. Can't go that one, he jabbed a thumb over his shoulder toward the town. No doubt. You from south of here, right? Buck nodded. A couple 100 miles. Yeah, me too. Ain't nothing behind us but a bunch of hills. My people up in 'em, so I say we go that way. Roscoe rested his arm across his bent knee and pointed with a long finger. Buck followed the line of where he was pointing, straight through the narrow passage between the sandbags, across the dozen or so tents set up around a common clearing to the fence on the other side. He couldn't see it from here, but he knew the layout of the camp well enough to see it in his mind's eye. There was a 15-foot bare space between the last tent and the sandbag wall that circled the entire fob. It was 6 feet of packed plastic resting against the hurricane fence that was topped with razor wire. How do we get over the fence? Ain't going over the fence, Atkins. Going through. Chapter 3. There were 6 of them in total. Roscoe met him in front of the barracks with 4 other guys. They didn't speak, just shifted apart so Buck could join them as they marched together toward the chow line. No one asked why they were under ruck, the stuffed packs added an extra 12 inches of distance between them. Most of the other soldiers kept glancing at the dark sky, waiting for the blinking red and yellow lights to overtop the horizon and swoop in to hover over the fob. The guys manning the guard post on the road were warned to be extra vigilant, because the noise and chaos of the chopper got the inhabitants of the town worked up. Last week, they had massed at the fence and pressed it forward, almost bending it in half before the pilot peeled off and the shuffling people followed the lights and roar of the rotors as it angled over the town. Any time now, Roscoe told them. Buck could feel the nervous anticipation coming off the men around him as they stood in line. He had to remember to move forward as the other soldiers advanced to get their MRE package and cup of weak mixed fruit punch. Should have joined the Air Force, Roscoe forced a joke. We'd be getting top sirloin and caviar right about now. No one laughed. It was the 1,000th time they'd heard it said. The cooks who were assigned to pass out the tiny plastic green pouches that looked a lot like the sandbag covers to Buck, just groaned and kept holding out the MREs to the soldiers. They watched what little sky they could see through the open face of the canvas tent, waiting, just like the rest of them. An MP stepped into the line and stared at Buck. Atkins, he barked. Come with me. Buck shot a glance at Roscoe. The man stared at him with dead eyes and shrugged. The MP grabbed Buck by the arm and yanked him out of line. He stripped his rifle from the strap and slid it over his own head. Captain wants to see you. The policeman lifted wrist behind his back, tried to plant it between his shoulder blades, but the angle of the oversized pack made him haul it away from Buck's body. It was an effective, if accidental move. Buck had to lean forward and tilt away from the man to ease pressure on his shoulder blade. It was awkward and painful, and put him in a position to see Roscoe and the other 4 men peel away from the chow line and move toward the back of the camp. Wait, Buck stuttered. And then they were at the captain's tent. They didn't have to go in. Captain Rush stood at ease in the opening of his command post. I told you what happens to deserters, Rush stated. Your soldiers don't appreciate your sharing your plan to abandon them. He glanced around. Jenkins is going to get a commendation in his file for turning you in. Rush and the MP marched Buck into the center of the fob. No time for a court-martial, Rush said. But I checked with Jag. We're on wartime footing, so I'm in the right. They stopped in the middle of the clear space. Platoon, Captain shouted to get their attention. The men standing around waiting for the helicopter tore their eyes from the sky and watched as the MP shoved Buck forward, wrist still gripped in his hand. This is what happens to deserters in my unit. He pulled his .45 and aimed it at Buck's head. Wait! Buck screamed. The chopper raced over the horizon and screamed across the top of the camp. All eyes jumped from the tableau on the ground to stare as the helo circled the fob, tail rudder spinning as it fought for control. Gunshots cracked from the guard post and men stared in confusion at the helicopter rotated around twice, spilling 2 boxes from the cargo hold. One landed on 2 men on one side of the clearing and crushed them under the splintering crate. The second crashed into the parking lot asphalt beside Captain Rush and the MP. The MP let Buck go and hopped back out of the way. Buck fell to one side as Rush pulled the trigger. The bullet pinged off the blacktop. The captain tried to draw a bead on Buck again, but more shots from the guard post caught his attention. Go see what they're shooting at, he barked at the MP. The man began running toward the guard post as the chopper roared in a circle and followed him. It ramped up into the air, flipped and pointed nose down. The engine quit and gravity grabbed it, dragged it down into the fence beyond the post. A fireball flashed across the dark sky. Buck saw black figures shuffling into the fire, shuffling past the fence, the stressed metal falling now with loud metallic snaps. He crawled toward the chow line, trying to put distance between him and the captain. Rush ran up to him, snatched him over by the fabric of his fatigues. He couldn't roll him over onto his back, because the pack was too big. "You can't escape justice," he pointed the weapon at Buck's face. A running soldier slammed into him, knocked Rush off balance. Buck scrambled up and took 3 stutter steps toward the back of the fence. Crack! 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 One shot buzzed over his head, close enough to his ear he could hear the passage of the bullet as it split the wind. The second and third slammed into his back and pitched him forward. More men were running now, screaming as the fence was overrun. The chopper exploded again as fire reached the second or reserve tank. "Stand the line! Stand the line!" Rush screamed. No one seemed to listen, or they didn't care. Soldiers ran around the fob, the rattle of automatic weapons fire adding to the din and confusion. Buck gasped a breath. He'd been shot, but he was alive, he thought. He began to crawl, his back aching, his head pounding. He crawled for the chow tent, for the break in the fence behind it. If it was there. Roscoe betrayed him, a distraction that would draw all eyes toward not only the chopper, but his execution. It was a good plan. Buck just hated he was on the wrong end of it. If the deserters did what they said, there would be a way out. He crawled faster. It still hurt, but he ran a hand over the front of his shirt to check for bleeding. He didn't find an exit wound. Which was a bad sign. It meant the bullet was still inside him. 2 bullets. He wondered if he should shift direction, make a run for the communication tent and try to call his wife one last time. Tell her to get in the attic and then find a way to go someplace safe when it was daylight. He tucked his knees up underneath him and pushed up on shaky legs. Buck glanced behind him, expecting to see a blood trail where he had crawled away from the carnage in the clearing. There was nothing. He reached around and felt his fatigues below the pack, to see if they were wet with blood, but they were dry. No way to know what was going on yet, but he did know he had to get clear. The sound of weapons fire grew louder all around him as the world came into a little better focus. A man tripped across from him. His rifle clattered across the asphalt and came to rest against Buck's feet. He reached down and picked it up. The other soldier, Baker, scrambled to his feet and opened his mouth to argue. He decided against it and ran back in the direction he had come from in the first place. Buck didn't know what was going on. Men screamed, shots rang out. Fire raged and people ran all around the fob, no set direction except to be somewhere other than where they were. He shook his head to try and clear some of the fog, then checked the magazine. Full. He shrugged the pack straps, then got afraid because moving it might shift whatever was keeping him from bleeding out. Buck stumbled toward the fence behind the chow tent. Chapter 4. The section of the fence was cut, just as he expected. Roscoe was smart about it. He cut the links near a pole, just above where the sandbags ended and short of the razor wire. The fence was folded back, almost large enough for a single man to slip through. Buck could see their boot prints in the sandbags, some shifted out of the order into a haphazard pattern somewhere between falling down and clinging on the verge of an avalanche. The camp behind him was a cacophony of noise and chaos as he clambered up onto the sandbags and fought for balance as one shifted from underneath him. It hit the concrete and busted open in a cascade of sand. Buck ducked through the fence and winced as pain shot across his back. The pack was stuck. He shoved his rifle through and let it slide to the ground and rest against the fence. Then he wiggled out of his pack, and hoped he wasn't setting himself up to pass out from blood loss. He curled out of the pack and rolled onto the bare ground on the other side of the fence. So far, so good. Buck took a moment to reach around and feel for anything leaking, but there was nothing but a little sweat, or what he hoped was sweat, in the small of his back. There was pain, yes, lots of it, but he couldn't feel blood pumping out of him. He didn't know if that was a good thing. A bullet wound leaked, that much he remembered from the little first aid training they gave in basic. But if he wasn't leaking, that meant the bullets punched through the pack in his shirt, and sealed the wound with fibers. It meant he had microscopic pieces of bullet and debris floating around in his system, and if he didn't get antibiotics, the wound would go septic. That word stuck with him. Sepsis. System overload and rotting from the inside. Maybe he could stay alive long enough to get Lucy and Charlie somewhere safe. He didn't know where that was at the moment, but he had 200 miles to figure it out. He stood up and reached for the pack. Rush leapt from behind the tent and grabbed a strap. Ah! He screamed, wordless in rage and madness. He lifted up a bloody arm and aimed that .45 at Buck. Something lunged out of the shadows and latched onto him, a moaning, groaning person from town. Or what had been a person? It was too dark to tell. All Buck could see was a limb or two thrashing as they went down in a tumble of darkness, a thin rectangle of light leaking through the space between the tents. He heard a gurgle, and a scream and 2 shots. Buck didn't stick around to see if Rush made it. He tore at the backpack, yanked it through with a rip of fabric and hustled off into the darkness as fast as he could. He slid to a stop. Rifle, he gasped as he remembered his weapon leaning against the fence. It was 10 yards back, maybe 15. Just a quick dash to grab it, then he could go. A moan sliced the space between him and the fence. He couldn't see what made it, just the sound of it in the darkness. Close. Not on him yet, but closing in. It moaned again. Buck gripped the pack tighter and began jogging as fast as he could in the dark. He ran and ran, until his feet hit asphalt and he could make out the lighter shade of darkness of the road. He pulled the pack tighter against his chest and kept running. Chapter 5. It must have been hours. That's what it felt like. There was no moon, but he could see the white stripes painted in dashes on the black top, faint ghost glows against the dark pavement. He ran on them, used the pale stretches of paint as a guide. Behind him, the fob burned. He wasn't sure who else escaped. He couldn't have been the only one. Well, him and Roscoe's group of deserters. Buck wondered if they could even be called that now. The post was gone. It would have been gone, no matter what, so were they deserting by getting scattered? He guessed that was a question for the Judge Advocate General if it ever came to that. Buck wasn't sure it would. The world would have to go straight again for that to happen, and it felt like everything had gone sideways fast. He decided to put his execution by firing squad to the back of his mind and focus on getting to Lucy. Getting home. His back still hurt. He needed to check it out, or get it checked, but he figured if the bullet had hit anything vital, he wouldn't be thinking about it right now. Bullets, he corrected. Though being shot twice and being that lucky meant something to him. He probably hadn't been hit as bad as it felt. He kept running though. Couldn't stop to inspect it until there was more light. By the look on the horizon in the direction he was moving, that would be morning. He glanced at the luminescent dials on his watch face and saw that was at 9 hours or more away. Buck slowed to a fast march, a stride that ate up 4 miles per hour, 1 mile every 15 minutes. Every soldier trained at that tempo, under ruck so they could maintain it for hours. It allowed a platoon to move fast and still conserve energy for the fight. Part of it was mental, he knew. Get in a rhythm. Keep moving. Get your mind locked on eating distance, staying at pace. He calculated he could knock out 20 miles before he had to take a break. If he didn't pass out from blood loss. He shook his head. He wasn't leaking fluid, because if he was, he'd be passed out on the side of the road and not marching down the middle like Napoleon going out to conquer. 200 miles would take 50 hours. Shit. He didn't think Lucy had that long. If they made it through the night, the bandits or marauders or whatever they were could come back tomorrow night and he would still get there too late. Wheels, he gasped as he marched. He needed transportation. Back at the fob, they hadn't seen anything on the road in 2 weeks, not even military transports. That worried him, but he knew that if he found a car he could make the trip home in just a few hours. A car lot would be even better. He didn't know how to hotwire a car, but on a lot, there would be keys. The problem with being from out of this area was, he didn't know where any car lots would be. He didn't know where anything would be. Buck stared at the dark landscape around him. There was a common misconception about total darkness. If a person was outside, it wasn't. It might seem like it, especially to people who lived in a city where street lights pushed back the night and turned the dark into a yellow halogen landscape. When those lights went out, people who were used to them were lost. Buck had been in the city for so long, he missed the lights too. Out here on the road though, the stars were bright enough to turn everything into shades of black. Like the asphalt underneath him, a milky gray ribbon that stretched away from him until it was lost. The trees in the fields, just darker shadows. He couldn't see far, which was fine, because he just kept moving forward, ignored the pain in his back, the hitch in his side. He realized he couldn't see a glow on the horizon either. There should be a glow from the city far ahead. A smudge on the horizon really, that washed up against the nighttime sky and made the stars disappear. But it was gone. Buck stopped and looked behind him. The air was yellow with the glow of a fire, but small. He had put a lot of distance between him and the camp. He had to blink. The brighter shade was stealing his night sight, making the world around him harder to make out. He turned back to the road and started shuffling forward again. Something moved in front of him. He froze. His eyes wouldn't adjust to the darkness, couldn't find what it was that spooked him. A noise, maybe? Maybe a shift in the shadows, a wind in the dark. He opened as wide as he could, tilted his head to listen. If he couldn't see it, maybe he could hear it. Tick, tick. There it was. Something clicked against the asphalt, a tick-click-tick sound of footsteps. He pounced back as they drew closer. Woof, a dog barked out at him. Son of a bitch, Buck said as the four-legged shadow skirted past him with the ticking click of claws on concrete. You scared me. The dog didn't answer. He took a step forward and a body lurched out of the dark and grabbed for him. Buck screamed and shifted the weight of his attacker over his hip. It landed on the asphalt with a sick thunk and moaned, hands still reaching for him. Buck kicked it away, kicked where the head was supposed to be. It was hard to tell in the dark, nothing to see but black on black, but he felt the solid thud of boot on skull. He kicked again, and again once more. Something cracked and the moaning stopped. Buck stumbled back from the lump on the ground, just a dark shape on a dark road. Impossible to make out any detail other than it was a person. Or maybe one of those things, the dead people, but he didn't know for sure. No way to know, really. Buck turned his back to the carnage and started walking again, faster now, trying to outrun the feeling of wanting to throw up, wanting to find a place to just hide. He moved faster and ignored the pain in his back and the dark night around him. Chapter 6. He hoped the people in the house didn't wake up. If they even were people anymore. He couldn't tell. All he knew was, they had a car in the carport. That was all. He wasn't about to knock on the door to ask if he could use it. End of times and all that. Survival of the fittest. He huffed as he snuck up the driveway toward the dark hulk under the metal roof next to the house. It fronted a field that ran a long way in either direction. He didn't know how far. All he knew is, he walked for a real long time, and when he saw the driveway, somehow, he could make out the shape of what was underneath the carport. A car. It could have been because it's what he expected. What else would people use a carport for? Motorcycles, maybe, and he would have been glad of that too. All he wanted was a set of wheels to carry him all the way home. He paused every so often and listened. The people who lived there might have dogs. The house was dark, but that didn't mean anything either. Everything was dark now, and not just because it was night. The lights went out a week ago, right about the same time the army moved in. A lot of people blamed the army too. Said they were taking the power for themselves, but he knew they used generators because tying into the power grid was problematic. He could see them and hear them, and out here, it was dark and quiet. No generators at the cracker box house set on the edge of a field just off the road. He couldn't tell what kind of car it was as he moved in closer. No noise yet, just the sound of crickets and his own breathing. Breathing? Who was he kidding? He was wheezing from the effort of sneaking up all hunched over. It made him shake his head. Probably not much use sneaking up because of the huffing and puffing like a big bad wolf getting ready to knock on the door. He didn't want in though. He wanted gone. The car was a sedan, one of the big old classics. It had to have a V8 under the hood, built back when gas was cheap and American classic meant size. It would ride like a dream, he bet, but hated the V8, because if the tank wasn't full, he wouldn't make it far. Beggars and choosers, he muttered in a hushed voice and paused by the driver's door. Still no noise. No new noise that he could hear. Nothing from the house, crickets or tree frogs in the field around them. And no moaning. Moaning was something that scared him, and in the short time since it started, a sound that set off alarm bells and jammed the emergency button on his fight or flight. He tried the handle. It was locked. Okay, he expected that. Even in the country, people locked their doors sometimes. He ran his fingers over the top of the door frame. If he had a wire hanger, he could slip one through easy enough. But he didn't, and he bet there wasn't one out here on the carport somewhere just waiting for him to run his hands along and find it. He'd have to get a rock and smash the window. It would make too much noise and wake up whoever was in the house or bring out whatever might be in there to investigate the noise. He would have to think of something else. He trailed a finger on the hood of the car, felt a layer of dust build up and flicked it in the darkness of the yard before he wiped it on his pants. He had a whim and checked the passenger side. It was locked too. But the back passenger door wasn't. He opened the door and winced at the rusty creak that echoed off the top of the metal roof. A stale sour stench rolled out of the car and he tried not to gag. The overhead light didn't show anything in the back seat and he moved slow as he eased it to check the front. It was empty too. He shook his head, unlocked the passenger front door and lay across the seat. It took a few moments to recall how it was done, but he cranked the ignition switch backwards, jacked it hard and broke the cylinder. "All right," he whispered in pride. He hadn't done that in 20 years, and it wouldn't work on newer models, but that was okay. He had learned how to do it on the older model cars in his hometown, and it was like riding a bike. Except it was Grand Theft Auto. He grinned to himself as he reached up and twisted the ignition. The engine groaned twice, coughed and turned over with a low rumble. "Thank God," he breathed. Something grabbed him by the ankle and yanked him out of the car. "Hey! Hey!" He kicked and bucked and earned a yelp of surprise and pain. "I wasn't gonna steal it," he cried as whoever it was let him go and he scrambled up. "You hotwired it," a man answered. He couldn't make out much in the weak light drifting out from the dome light. "Just boots and army fatigues. I lost the keys." "Do you live here?" He glanced over his shoulder at the still dark house. Their noise hadn't brought anyone running, no doors were opened, no questions called out. Best of all, not gun blasts cracking the air to scare them off. Maybe he could pull it off. "Yes," he answered. "This is my house." Aha, the guy didn't sound like he believed him. "I live here," he stated again, this time with more conviction. He wondered if he could jump in the car and yank the door closed, lock the guy in the army boots out fast enough. If he could get in the car and lock it down tight, he could get away and this guy could eat it. "Move," the man told him. "Move what?" He stepped closer to the door. The other way, the guy took a step closer too. He darted for the opening, grabbed the door and pulled. This time, the guy grabbed him by the wrist, hauled him out across the slick leather seat and deposited him on the ground next to the car. He scrambled up as the guy slid across the seat and under the steering wheel. The car lurched forward when the man dropped it in gear. He hopped up and ran beside the open door, jumped it as it smacked the thin hollow pole holding up the metal roof. The door slammed shut, almost took his foot off, but he got everything inside before it did. The light went out, and the guy fumbled for headlights, hands searching the knobs. "It's over there," he pointed. "I got it." He studied the man's face in the glow of the dashboard lights. His mouth was a tight line of concentration, strong-looking hands gripped the wheel tight as he glared at the road. "You in the army?" He tried to start a conversation. "We can ride together," the guy said. "We don't have to be friends." He held up two hands in surrender and leaned against the passenger door. "I don't got a problem with that," he said. "You want to trade names at least?" "Buck," the man behind the wheel answered. "Buck Atkins." Chapter 7. Buck watched the man in the passenger seat from the corner of his eye. When he stumbled across the farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, he thought it was destiny. Finding a guy who knew how to hotwire a car, and in fact, had it started, was proof it was meant to happen. Now that they were sharing the car together though, he wasn't sure what to say. He felt embarrassed for trying to leave the man behind. And it bothered him the way the guy said his name. "Is that short for something?" "What?" "Buck?" "Just Buck." "Are you a cowboy?" "Do I look like a cowboy?" Buck rolled his head on his shoulder to give the man a look before turning back to the road. The headlights on the giant sedan were covered in dust, so the glow didn't extend too far. Buck kept them pegged at a steady 40 miles per hour. "Do they still got cowboys in the army?" the passenger asked him. "I mean, they used to, right? With horses and shit. But then they all went to helicopters. Or tanks, I forget which one." "Both." "Right," the man agreed. "Both. Aren't you going to ask me my name, Buck? Nope. It's Miguel Sandoval. The man reached a hand across the seat. Buck ignored it and he let it drop after a few moments. I got a question for you, Buck, the not cowboy. Just Buck. That's what I said. You can cut the cowboy crap, okay? It's Buck. My dad liked country music, he liked Buck Owens and I was named for him. Hee-haw, right? Right. Yeah, my grandmother used to watch that shit, said Miguel. I liked to sit with her sometimes cause she would make these roasted peanuts with a little sweet, a little spice, and we'd eat it while she watched. Buck kept his eyes on the road. The guy next to him, Miguel, had a round little belly on his round little body, a thin black mustache on his round puffy lips. He didn't look like the kind of guy that would do too well in a situation like this, like his survival chances were closer to the zero side of the scale. Yet the man had hotwired a car, he corrected, which was more than he could say for himself. If Miguel hadn't been there, Buck might have broken into the house to find the keys, and he was glad he didn't have to hurt anyone inside to get them. Not that he had anything to hurt them with. Just his hands, and that might be enough on some people. If the people in the house were armed though, it could have been a different story. How much gas we got? Miguel brought him out of his imagined alternative timeline. Buck glanced at the gauge. Quarter tank. He watched the man's face contort. Damn, Miguel grunted. Big V8 like this, that's gonna get us 50 miles, maybe more. If we find a station, we can get more. I don't know, man, Miguel said. Not so much been open around here since you guys came to town. Were you in the city? Yeah, in a hotel by the airport. Right where you put the fence up. If I could have opened up my window, I could have touched it. You got out? He could feel Miguel looking at him, studying him. Whatever the man saw, he took a breath after a moment that sounded like a long sigh. I think I made it about half an hour before you did, he said. I mean, I got over the fence cause the hotel was going to shit, you know what I'm saying? Buck shook his head. You Army came in and told everybody to stay inside, stay in the fence. So I was trapped, like. And then, all the dead people came up and started eating everybody. I had some breakfasts and stuff from right when it started, so I just hid in my room. But I could hear him screaming and stuff. Miguel shuddered. And then, they weren't screaming anymore, but they were in the hall so I couldn't get out that way. Had to go out the window and I was on the second floor. He lifted up his leg to show his right ankle as he pressed his foot to the dash. Felt like I busted my ankle, but I got over the fence. How? Threw out all the pillows and blankets first, said the round man. That's how I didn't bust my ankle cause I landed on them. Put the blankets on the razor wire and flip-flopped my fat ass over the top. Smart. Yeah, you think so? If I was so smart, how come I didn't do it 2 weeks ago then? Hell, 3 weeks ago after you shut it all down. He patted his stomach. Still a good diet though. I've lost about 20 pounds just sitting in my room twiddling my thumbs. Buck's stomach rumbled, agitated by the thought of food. Yeah, me too, Miguel chuckled. What's your story? Overrun, Buck said. The whole city's overrun now. Even the checkpoint? Gone. Damn. Anyone else get out? Buck shrugged. I'm not sure. Don't you got backup orders to regroup or do a rendezvous or some army shit like that? Buck shot him a glare. I'm going home to my wife and kid. That bad, huh? Miguel nodded. When the news stopped, I figured shit just got real, you know. But the army packing it in and getting the hell out, that makes it real. Scary. It is. You're telling me, Miguel shifted his leg back to the floorboard. Does it stink in here to you? Cause even with the windows down, man, I think it reeks. Buck nodded in the green glow of the dashboard light. Where you going? I mean, you stole this car from me, you were headed somewhere. You were stealing the car when I took it from you, Buck reminded. I started the car, Miguel corrected. Technically, it hadn't been stolen yet. You a lawyer and a cowboy soldier? I'm a husband and a dad. Sorry. 200 miles, Buck said, almost to himself. It's only 200 miles. He glanced at the odometer. Less now. 190. That's 4 hours in this thing. Miguel shook his head. We won't make it that far. Gas won't last. We'll find a way to make it last, said Buck. You in a hurry, huh? Yes, Buck snapped. Morning might be too late. Miguel shook his head. I ain't talked to my mom in 3 weeks, since you guys off communication. You don't see me freaking out about it. Buck growled. All right, Miguel leaned against the door. You just keep on cruising and we see what we see, okay? Buck gripped the wheel in both hands and fought the urge to jam the gas all the way to the floor, pedal to the metal until he could get home. This speed was safe. The road might be blocked, and there wasn't much gas. Slow was steady, and steady was supposed to be fast. It sure as hell didn't feel fast. Chapter 8. The gas gave out an hour later. Shit, said Miguel. Buck let the car coast another 400 feet before it crunched to a stop. You just gonna leave it in the middle of the road like that? Miguel looked at Buck as the dome light flashed on. Can't just pull to the side or something like that? Buck kept his mouth shut as he stepped out of the car. He leaned back in and searched the underside of the dash. Wanted to check the trunk, he explained. Could have something we can use. No keys. He slapped the roof in frustration. Miguel cracked a smile and opened the glove box and pressed a button inside. The trunk latch clicked open. These older models like to hide their secrets, he grinned as he slipped out to join Buck. Let's check it out. Buck moved along the edge of the car. He hooked a finger under the rim of the popped open trunk and angled it up as he swung around the back. A shadow lunged across the pale glow of the trunk light and grabbed him by the front of the fatigues. He danced back with a yelp, dragging a skeletal arm with him. The shadow moaned as a second hand reached for him, fingers scratching on the thick woven fabric. Miguel slammed the roof on the head of the monster, once, twice. Bone cracked and slushy liquid splashed across the asphalt. Was that? Miguel sputtered. One of them. Buck brushed off his fatigue top, checking to make sure everything was okay. Did it get you? Miguel kept the car between them. No, Buck answered. He glanced at the trunk and was glad it was still dark. They couldn't see the mess they had made. Guess we didn't need anything in there after all. Miguel looked up and down the deserted road. This goes to the city, he said. How far? Buck tried to recall a name from the map. All he got was a general direction and some vague details. A plant town, until the factory shut down. Lots of empty buildings, and vacant lots. The population would be low, and he liked that. He wondered if they rounded up who was left and moved them into the larger city? A move like that would make sense, but that was above his pay grade. He just didn't know. 10 miles? Miguel guessed. 2 hours, Buck said. There might be people there, and if they were, they could probably find a car. He wanted another car. I'm not as fast as you, Miguel patted his round belly. I don't know if I can keep up. You better, Buck warned him. I'm not waiting. Chapter 9. We need a flashlight, Miguel said. He kept his voice low. There was no telling what could hear them out in the dark. Too much attention, said Buck. Make us a target. He sounded tough, but he kept his voice low too. There, he pointed. Miguel tried to follow his direction, but couldn't make out anything other than a dark blog against the darkness of the horizon. What is it? Building, said Buck. What about it? Parking garage. We can't go in there, said Miguel. Why not? Buck ignored him and angled for the black structure. It's dark. It's dark out here. I mean, darker. Out here, we've got starlight. He made a motion with his hands to take in the starlit sky. In there, you can't see your hand in front of your face. Besides, how do you know there are cars in there? I don't, said Buck. But I don't see any out here. I don't see anything out here. Except that. He moved his arms. Buck stared hard into the darkness. Shadows moved up the street toward them. A lot of them. We need to go, said Buck. The moaning reached them next. Whatever you say, Miguel agreed and hustled in front of Buck toward the brick building. They jogged across the open space in front of the box-like structure. It was 6 stories tall and took up almost the entire block. It was surrounded by a parking lot on 3 sides, and a green grassy space on the 4th. The parking lot was empty, and Miguel held out little hope for any transportation in the dark space underneath. This is stupid, he huffed as Buck caught up to him and passed him. Keep your fingers crossed, the soldier called over his shoulder as he reached the double doors. Buck yanked them open and ushered Miguel through before slamming them closed. The Walking Dead chased them, piled up against the glass door. Fingers scratched against the glass that groaned under the pressure of so much weight against them. "Find a way out," he ordered. It was a darker in the foyer. Stairs disappeared up one side of the wall, leading into an ebon void. Doors lined the opposite wall. Miguel tried one. Locked, he called out and moved to the other. The glass doors behind them cracked and shattered as bodies spilled through from the outside. Miguel twisted the knob as a dead man lumbered through the now open door and snapped at his face. He screamed. Buck grabbed the attacker and spun him around into the bodies coming through the front door. He jerked Miguel by the shirt and dragged him up the stairs. They pounded up together as the dead gained their feet and moaned their way after. Buck spied the woman at the head of the stairs on the 5th floor. Her gray hair looked like cobwebs from the candlelight held in her hand. She sputtered in Spanish, shooting a string of high-pitched syllables toward Buck as he mounted the steps. "What's she saying? How the hell do I know? You're Spanish, aren't you?" "Man, I'm from New York. I don't speak Spanish." Buck shook his shaved head as he tried to calm the woman down. She screeched at him, a cascade of lightning-fast words that washed over him. He could understand taco and cerveza and bono, but that was the limit of his Spanish-speaking skills, and he was about 100% certain she was not saying any of those. "Tell her to be quiet," he hissed. "I said, I don't speak Spanish," Miguel hissed back. "Pretty sure the zombies don't give a shit about your native tongue." Buck glanced toward the hallway. "Except how it tastes." He turned back to Miguel. "You know, when they eat it." "I got it." Miguel put a finger on his nose and made the universally recognized signal for "shut the hell up." His "shh" echoed off the walls in the hall, louder than her high-pitched voice. The volume of it shocked her. At least that's what he thought, as he broke out in a huge grin. Then she ambled back through an open doorway and tried to shut it on them. "Guess you pissed her off," said Buck. A growling moan bounced off the bare walls from the stairwell. "Shit," said Miguel. He threw his shoulder against the door and forced it back open as they slipped inside. The wrinkled old woman put a finger to her nose and gave a very quiet, "shh." "Now she does it," Buck whispered as he put his back against the door. It thudded in the frame as a body pressed against it, dead fingernails clawing against the wood. "You think we're safe?" Buck stared at Miguel for a second as the body outside the door thudded against it again. "We're in the projects," Buck whispered. "This door is hollow core." "What does that mean?" "It means you better be looking for another way out." Thud. And fast. Miguel moved past the wrinkled old woman as he searched the tiny box of an apartment. The walls were dingy with age, colored by years of cigarette smoke and cooking grease from the 4-burner stove in the galley kitchen. 2 doors were in one wall, a television on a stand against the other. One room led to the toilet, the other to a small bedroom big enough for a full-size bed and a dresser and not much else. No way out, Miguel panicked. The zombie plowed against the door at the sound of his voice, made it shake in the frame. The old woman dropped to her knees and began chanting a prayer. "Fire escape," Buck groaned as he pressed harder against the door. His face contorted at the effort and he wished he still had his rifle. Even without bullets, he could use it as a club and beat the damn undead thing to death with it. Dead again, he tried to bite back a manic laugh and failed. The old woman prayed harder, her high-pitched voice getting louder. The wound of it drove the zombie outside crazy and the clawing and scratching redoubled. "We're trapped," Miguel screamed. "There's no way out." Buck's eyes darted around the room as he searched for something, anything. "Bring me that," he waved a hand toward the television. Miguel struggled to pick it up. "Not that." Buck waved some more. "That." "What?" "The stand." "Bring the stand." The pounding against the door grew louder, and now he could tell there were 2 of them. Thud. Thud. They were offbeat right now, but if they hit the thin wood at the same time, it could collapse under their weight. He shuddered with every bounce of the dead body against it. "Hurry," he grunted. Miguel groaned as he lifted up the television and struggled it over to the couch. He grabbed the stand, and screeched as he tried to move it. It didn't budge. Bam. Bam. "Come on." "I can't move it," Miguel strained. "It's too heavy for me." "Come here," Buck ordered. Miguel shuffled over. Buck grabbed him by the shoulders and shifted him into his place against the door. The rotund accountant almost bolted under the first hit against his back, but Buck was waiting for it. He shoved him back against the door. "Don't move." He ran to the long television stand and yanked against it. It was a buffet table in a prior life, something people used to serve food, he imagined. Now the old woman used it for storage and knickknacks. It was heavy. But he was determined and scared. Buck shoved it across the floor, gouging out long scrapes in the scuffed smooth plastic linoleum. The woman stopped praying long enough to scream at him, and he didn't need to understand Spanish to know she was bitching about the floor. "Move," he shouted. Miguel raced away from the door. "Not you!" Buck screamed. "Her!" It was too late. The zombies got in sync, or maybe there wasn't much holding the door up except the weight of Miguel. It collapsed in with a loud clatter and one zombie pitched forward onto the floor. The second lumbered across it and straight at the old woman. Buck tried to grab her, tried to pull her out of the way, but she was terrified as the mangled hands locked onto her shawl. She shouted a prayer as she lunged backwards to escape, but she wasn't as strong as the dead man trying to bite her. His teeth sank into her neck as momentum carried them across the shallow room. The two of them crashed into the window and fell out in a shower of shattered glass. "Shit," Buck breathed. "Shit," Miguel agreed as the second zombie climbed up and ambled toward them. Buck grabbed it by an outstretched arm, spun it toward the now open window and sent it sailing through. The back of its knees caught on the low sill, and one hand grabbed the wall to arrest the fall. Miguel darted forward and kicked it once, twice, and the zombie kept falling through the window. They heard it splat on the asphalt below and took a moment to catch their breath. "Did you see what I did?" Miguel crowed in a whisper. "I saw. Kicked the damn thing right out of the window." "Yeah," Buck agreed. "That was good work." "Good work? Man, that was fucking cool. Too bad about the old lady though." "Yeah," Miguel sighed. "But did you see what I did?" Buck shook his head. "Keep an eye out." He moved into the narrow kitchen and began emptying the cabinets into a shopping bag. "What are you doing?" "Food. Shelter. Warmth," Buck ticked off on his fingers. "We need to find a place for the night and hole up. See where we stand in daylight." "No way, man," Miguel said. "I think we should keep moving in the dark. They can't see us." "If they can't see us, we can't see them." "Right. Okay, new plan. We fix the door and stay in here." Buck shook his head. "I want something more solid between us than a piece of plywood. Plus, we can't rely on your karate skills to get the next one." "I did pretty good." Buck shoved a fabric grocery bag full of canned goods into his arms. "Find a can opener to put in there, will you?" He checked the doorway before moving into the bedroom and opened the closet door. He didn't care about making a mess, and he was sure the old woman wasn't going to complain now, so tossed stuff on the bed as he searched for a bag or something stronger to carry their supplies. Buck checked again before he crossed back into the kitchen. "What's that for?" Miguel asked as the soldier laid a rolling suitcase on the floor and zipped the bags of food into it. "Easier to carry," Buck zipped a wheel under a finger. "Anything in the fridge?" Miguel cracked open the door. "Not much," he passed out 4 bottles of beer. "But these." "Score," Buck put 2 in the suitcase, passed one back to Miguel and twisted off the top to take a big drink from the last one. "What are we celebrating?" "We're alive," said Buck. "So far." "So far, that's enough." Chapter 10. Buck peeked around the edge of the splintered door frame. The hall beyond was clear. "Think there's a back way?" he asked. Miguel tapped a piece of wood hanging on the wall next to the door. It was cut in the shape of an old-fashioned skeleton key with 4 tiny brass hooks screwed along the body. 2 keys hung off a key ring fob with a Buick logo. "If there is, we found a ride." Buck reached up and slipped the keys into his pocket. "Good work." He peeked around the edge of the door again. "It's quiet," he said, and wondered where the rest of the monsters went. "Don't say that," Miguel whispered. "That's what they say in scary movies just before things get bad." "Too quiet," Buck agreed. "I'd knock on wood, but I don't want to make any more noise than we have to." "Let's just go," said Miguel. He hefted a flashlight and gripped the rolling suitcase with the other hand. Buck nodded and double-checked the hall again for the 3rd time. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He led them out into the darkness. Miguel used the flashlight aimed at the ground 3 feet in front of them. Buck had instructed him to hold it low, to keep it down by his waist and only use it to illuminate where they were going to step. It was a trick to keep their pupils dilated in the dark confines of the building, and by having it behind him, it made Miguel the target and not him. He kept that piece of information to himself. Besides, anything going for the light would have to go through him first, and not in any tough guy the buck stops here sort of way. Literally, he was between any monster or zombie that lurched out of the dark to get to the light. Part of it was, he thought his reflexes might be better than Miguel's. His new companion had a soft look, like he was used to being a desk jockey. Not that Buck was much better. His job as a soldier was logistics first, but once the shit started hitting the fan, everybody became a bang-bang specialist. They reached a doorway at the opposite end of the hall and he pressed a hot hand against cool metal. He wasn't sure what he expected. No sound at least, because power was off to the building, so if it was connected to a fire alarm, it wouldn't go off. He glanced over his shoulder at Miguel. The shorter man's face was dim in the weak up glow of the flashlight, and strained with fear. He nodded. Buck pushed open the door and led them through. The stairs were empty. The 2 men made their way down, pausing at each landing to access and listen. It was quiet. When they reached the metal door marked with a big P for parking, he knew why. It was closed too, creating an effective protected silo in the stairway. Buck wished for a moment they could remain, stay hidden until daylight, and search for the dead woman's car then, when the inside of the parking garage would be more like twilight than night. But his wife needed him. He could feel time ticking away in his head, and every moment delayed meant 1 more minute of his family in danger. She needed him and he needed to get to her and keep them safe. Miguel gave a grunt that Buck took for assent and he opened the door to the dark space beyond. Chapter 11. The parking garage was silent. Low ceilings and thick concrete muffled their footsteps as they walked into the vast emptiness. "Where is it?" Miguel hissed. Buck strained his eyes. The light from the flashlight reached less than 20 feet, fading into nothing. It failed to penetrate the darkness and didn't show any cars around them. Searching would take time. He slid his hand into his pocket and pulled out the key fob. He could feel 3 buttons under his thumb and wondered if it was like the one he had for his own truck back home. 1 button to lock it, 1 button to unlock, and 1 for the tailgate or trunk, since it was a car. The buttons would click as they unlocked the car, and the sound would carry in the silence. The 2 men could use it like a beacon. He clicked it. A panic horn began bleating 200 yards away from them, the yellow headlights flashing on and off, blinding them and illuminating several walking bodies between them. The loud harsh blast of the horn bounced off the low concrete ceiling and filled the air. "Turn it off," Miguel screamed over the horn. Buck jabbed at the button as the lights flashed around them. The walking bodies shuffled toward the car, drawn by the noise and light. Buck finally got the 3rd button right and silenced the panic alarm. It stopped honking, and the lights stayed on for a moment. The silence caught Miguel mid-shout. "Off." He finished. The bodies between the car and them turned toward the 2 men and began moaning. "Shit," Miguel said in a much lower voice. "Run." Buck screamed. He pounded toward the car, boots slapping against the concrete floor. He could hear Miguel running after him, taking his advice, the humming roar of suitcase wheels whirring. Buck darted past a set of outstretched hands and juked left to avoid a second set. His movement drew their attention away long enough for Miguel to swing to the right and arc around the dead. He reached the car a moment before Buck and fumbled at the latch on the passenger side. The door was still locked. He made a wordless shout that meant to be a request, but came out a high-pitched wail as 2 monsters that were once people stumbled out of the darkness, reaching for him. Miguel used the flashlight to bash away their hands and dropped the suitcase as he hopped onto the hood of the car and scrambled backwards. Buck clicked the lock and fumbled into the driver's seat, yanking open the back passenger door even as he shut his own. Miguel slid off the hood and threw himself into the back seat, yanked the door closed behind him as dead fingers reached the glass and tried to scratch their way in. Buck searched for the ignition on the steering column and dash, but there was no place to put the key. "Button." Miguel reached over the back seat and pointed to a small round circle marked start. Buck jammed it with his finger and the car sparked to life. He jacked the gear down to D. "Wait," Miguel shouted. He stretched across the back seat, opened the far door and struggled for a moment to yank the suitcase inside. He made it after a moment and dropped it in the floorboard. Go. Go. Buck slammed his foot against the accelerator and the car took off. Dead bodies careened from the fenders and sides of the vehicle as he circled around, searching for an exit. The headlights illuminated a dark opening under a black exit sign and he took it. The car peeled out from under the garage and slid sideways in the street as he fought it under control. It took 5 minutes to reach the highway and get their breathing under control. Buck gripped the wheel with both hands and stared off into the darkness. You want to come up here? Miguel leaned back in the seat and tried to compose himself, bring his racing heart back to something close to normal. In a minute, he said. It took another 10 before he crawled over and settled into the passenger seat. Chapter 12. You want me to drive? I've got it, Buck answered. He kept his eyes locked on the road. I just thought, you might be getting tired or something. I'm not. Well, if you do, I can take over for a little bit. Thanks. They drove for 10 more miles in silence that stretched into just under 13 minutes. Buck eased off the gas. You want me to take over? Miguel sat up in his seat. What's that? He pointed with his nose and a nod. What's what? Miguel searched with him. All he could see was a police cruiser pulled to the side of the road ahead of them. Buck slowed even further. As they approached it. Cop car? Yeah, Buck agreed. But what's it doing out here? Crashed? Miguel guessed. Buck eased the massive land yacht behind the police cruiser and clicked the headlights over to bright. It looked empty. What are you doing? Miguel asked as Buck shifted the car into park and opened his door. Stay here, the soldier ordered. Miguel watched as he approached the rear of the cruiser and banged his hand on the trunk. Buck danced back, as if he expected something to happen. Nothing jumped out at him. He tried the driver's side door and opened it up. Miguel watched him lean in and move around a moment before he stood up straight and waved for him to join Buck at the car. Is it dead? Miguel asked as he approached. Get the trunk open, Buck ordered. Miguel swung around to the passenger side of the cruiser. Under the dash, he instructed. What if this one has a dead body in it too? Get that loose, if you can, Buck said as his fingers felt along the underside of the dashboard and clicked open the hood of the car, then the trunk. Miguel went to work on the locking mechanism holding a short-barreled shotgun upright next to a dead laptop terminal. Buck stopped by the back door and fought to ease the trunk up from that angle, just in case something was inside. It was empty. He dragged out 2 black bags of gear and put them in the back seat of the massive Buick, then checked for more. All right, he grinned. There was an AR-15 strapped to the underside of the trunk hood. He unfastened it, checked the magazine for a load and short-strapped it across chest. He found a backup handgun in the corner, and cleared out road flares, a fire extinguisher and 2 bags of flex cuffs. Buck put everything into the back of the Buick. Miguel stood up from the passenger seat and lofted the shotgun in victory. Got it, he whispered a shout. His face fell as he saw the rifle strapped to Buck's chest. You got one too. Buck patted it. Let's roll. They climbed back into the big car and pulled back on the road. It wasn't far now. Chapter 13. What do you think is going to happen? Miguel stared through the windshield at the road that stretched in front of them. I don't know. Buck gripped the wheel and kept the speed locked at 50. He kept calculating the time and distance in his mind, and figured 50 would eat a lot of miles and still give him time to react for anything that might block the road. He didn't want to slam them into a pileup of crashed cars. They made the rest of the drive in silence and pulled into the entrance of a subdivision outside of town. Large brick houses sat in the middle of expansive yards that bordered winding streets. Nice, said Miguel as he stared at the dark homes. You must be rich. Not really, Buck answered. Her folks wanted our kid to grow up in a nice place. They helped. Did it? Help? We have this place. Yeah, but now, places like this are a target, right? They were before too, said Buck. Lots of porch pirates. Some break-ins. He stopped the car in front of a home. This your place? Further up, Buck nodded. Then why did we stop here? I don't recognize that truck. Miguel stared at a crew cab truck parked across the front of a driveway. He couldn't see anyone in the cab. It could have come after you left. That's why I'm afraid of. Think it's them? Buck shot a look in his direction. He didn't know who the truck belonged to or even if it belonged to anyone. It might have been abandoned or just parked there as people fled out from the neighborhood. Or it could be the men his wife feared. Back to steal. Back to take. Back to kill. Wait here, he rested a hand on the butt of his rifle as he opened the door and stepped out. Screw that, Miguel grumbled. He joined Buck at the front of the car. The soldier held up the key fob and clicked the Buick locked. This looks like the kind of neighborhood you don't have to worry about that, he tried a joke. Prophylactic, said Buck. Like a condom, Miguel snorted. I'm a safety guy. Buck slid the fob back into his pocket and started up the road. He slipped off the asphalt, crossed the sidewalk and into the soft manicured grass that was beginning to show need of tending. Mature tall trees cast darker shades of black under their spreading boughs, and Buck slipped through the shadows over the yards. He held the rifle ready, unsure of what he might encounter, mindful of Miguel on his heels, wheezing and huffing to keep up. He stopped at the corner of a 2-story brick home and studied a ranch-style home next door. This is it, he whispered over his shoulder. Anything? Miguel gasped. Buck shook his head. What do we do? Just go up and knock? The soldier cocked his head to one side and listened. The street was quiet, just the insect hum and chirp of tree frogs from the greenbelt at the back of the homes. 3 ways in, he said. Garage, front door and slider at the rear. You go around back and wait. For what? A signal. What kind of signal? Are you gonna whistle? Yell? You'll know it. Gates on that side. He pointed with one hand as he took off for the front door in a fast jog, gun tucked against his shoulder. Chapter 14. The front door was open. It was what he was afraid of. Buck bounced a shoulder against it and went through into the hallway beyond. There was a dining room on the left, and an open office in front of him, both empty. He could see into the backyard and watched as Miguel came through the gate and around the side of the house. 2 shots rang out from the living room on one side of the house and Miguel went down as Buck heard a woman scream from the master bedroom on the other side of his home. He crashed through the half-open bedroom door and bounced off the wall. A tall figure stood over his wife, dragging her from the closet as his little girl screamed in terror. Buck sent a round through the tall man's head. The body crumpled on top of his wife and knocked the wind out of her. The wall next to his face exploded in a puff of plaster and dust as a second man shot at him from the bathroom. Buck dropped to his knees, swung around and fired 2 rounds into the attacker's center mass. The body splayed backwards into the bathroom suite. He wanted to go check on his wife, wanted to comfort his child, but there were still enemies in the house. He spun around on his knees and peeked through the door to see who was coming to investigate the shooting. A third intruder ran across the open office and shot through the wall. If Buck had been standing, he would be dead. The bullets showered him with shards of wallboard and insulation. He tucked around the doorframe and sent a shot into the man running toward him. They crashed together as the man fell on top of him, pounding him into the hardwood floor. Buck held the barrel of the pistol away from his head, aimed it the far way so he could keep his family clear. The intruder grappled for Buck's rifle with his free hand, keeping it from him. They wrestled and Buck saw the 4th man as he walked up the hallway and lifted his gun. He could see up the barrel, the bore as large as a tunnel, as the bandit aimed over his compatriot's shoulder. He could see the blue eyes over a bandana that covered the man's mouth and lower face, see the way electric lantern light played across his bushy eyebrows. Saw the eyes crinkle in anger and pleasure as the finger tightened on the trigger. He heard the explosion of the gun, the sound of the bullet crashing into the hardwood next to his head, the splinter of wood as it bit his ear in long bloody traces. Felt the spatter of warm liquid and chunks across his face, and the pain of a second body plopping on top of him. Miguel shoved the headless dead man off Buck and grabbed the still struggling survivor. He jammed the shotgun under the man's chin and rolled him off Buck. "Are you dead?" Miguel shouted. His face was streaked with blood from a long gash across his temple where a bullet grazed him. Blood dripped onto his shirt, wild eyes trying to take it all in at once. Buck spat sludgy stuff out of his mouth as he sat up and cradled his rifle. He aimed at the bad guy laying on the floor. Lucy crawled up next to him, took the intruder's pistol from him and shot him in the face. She dropped the gun onto the floor and sobbed a quick breath. She crawled back into the closet and picked up their daughter. Miguel helped Buck up and watched as he went to them and held them tight. Chapter 15. They still had running water, so cleanup was easy. The dead bodies though, not so much. What now? Lucy whispered. Trauma made her voice tiny, a little more than a whisper. Buck wondered if anything else happened before he shot the tall man. It looked like he had found them in the closet, looked as if Buck had stopped him first, but he didn't know. At least his daughter was just scared. Lucy covered her eyes as she carried the little girl into the den on the other side of the house. The only evidence of intruders there was the shattered glass in the slider where one of the men had shot at Miguel. Buck held the key fob out to Miguel. Think you can bring the car in front of the garage? Miguel pressed the makeshift bandage against his head and nodded. The movement brought a wince to his face as pain lanced from the wound. We're not staying, Buck said to Lucy. Where will we go? He didn't answer. He didn't know. Is she okay? He moved to Lucy and took them both into his arms again. She didn't flinch. At least there was that much. You weren't here. I tried, he said into her hair. It smelled of fear and sweat and strawberries, and he hoped he would forget it. Someday. Dad. Did you hide in the attic? He said. I put stuff in front of the doors, Lucy answered. I forgot the sliding door. I thought the backyard was safe? She lost her voice on the last word. Buck petted her and bit back any comments. He wanted to rage for a moment, tell her he told her so, told her what to do and where to hide. But she was scared, and he was scared, and he knew that lashing out was just his own fear. Dad, his daughter said again. Buck heard the moan before he saw her pointing. The dead man grabbed him by the fatigues and rode him down as Lucy screamed. Buck held the gnashing teeth away from his face, his forearm pressed hard against the neck of the snapping dead man. Lucy backed away into the wall, eyes desperate in a search for escape. Buck kicked and bounced, tried to get the dead thing off of him, but it was no use. Miguel skipped through the front door and planted a foot in the chin of the thing like he was kicking the winning goal at the World Cup. The head snapped back, cracked the neck and knocked it off Buck. He rolled out from under it, and grasped for his rifle. A single shot silenced it. Check the others, he instructed. Miguel nodded, but the other bandits had headshots and weren't moving. We can't stay, Lucy repeated over and over. Buck nodded and began grabbing food from the cabinets, lining up meager supplies to add to their trove in the trunk. We'll go, he said. Get her a few clothes, some toys. We need blankets, camping gear. Lucy took a deep breath and nodded. Tears stained her eyes, cheeks blotchy in the LED lantern light, but now that she had a direction, she seemed resolved. Help me, she told their daughter. Buck handed a tote bag to Miguel, who began piling cans and boxes of food into it in neat stacks. This is all kinds of screwed up, he said. I think they'll be okay, Buck answered. We just have to get away from here so they can think about something else. I mean the world, man. Now. Buck stopped and stared at a can of noodles and sauce in his hand for a moment. Yeah, he agreed. You gonna give me a ride to my mom's, right? Buck nodded. All right then, said Miguel. We can pick her up and take her with us, you know. She can work some miracles with all this. Buck paused with another can in his hand. You didn't think about me coming with, did you? Miguel asked. The soldier shook his head. Man, I saved your life. I know, Buck answered. I was just focused on getting them safe. And I helped, Miguel said. So now the shoe is on the other foot. Here's the plan. We got food. We got your family. Now we get mine too. We get some camping gear and go hide in the hills until this is all over. You think this is going to be over? Yeah man, someone is working on this somewhere right now. I mean, shit is messed up, yeah. But smart people are doing something about it. This is just like a blip on the historic radar. Of course he's coming with us, Lucy said from the hallway door. I didn't say he couldn't, Buck answered. He saved you. He saved us. And we'll go get his mom and save her. Buck nodded. He could have pointed out that he wasn't saying no, that he just didn't think about Miguel coming along, but it would come out sounding like an argument, and he didn't want that either. He picked up the 4 totes of supplies. Let's get these packed and get going, he said. He didn't wait to see if they followed him out. Chapter 16. They piled into the car and Buck drove. Lucy offered the front passenger seat to Miguel so the little girl could stretch out on the back seat and sleep. Miguel gave short directions in an excited whisper, almost vibrating on the seat as they drew closer to a row of houses on a country road on the far side of town. Buck pulled into the gravel driveway in front of a simple square clapboard house in the middle of a tired yard, surrounded by pine trees. He reached for his rifle. "It's okay," Miguel said. "I don't want to scare her." He crossed the front yard and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, he knocked again. It was louder the third time, and after the fourth, he hopped down from the steps and went around to the side of the house. "Heavy sleeper," he said almost in an apology to Buck as the soldier stepped out of the car, and followed, rifle held ready. "Me too," he said. Miguel knocked on the window 3 times, then again, louder. "Mom," he shouted. "Quiet," Buck admonished. "It's my mom, man," Buck yelled. "We don't know what else is out here." "Mom." Miguel banged the window again. "Did you try the door?" "What? Is the door locked?" "Oh," said Miguel. He ran back to the front door and tried it. The knob turned in his hand and opened up to a dark interior. "Mom," he called inside. He had to jump back as her dead body lumbered through and grabbed for him. He leapt from the steps as she fell forward. Her leg snapped backwards with a loud crack, but she ignored the awkward angle and the dangling limb below her knee as she crawled after Miguel. He stuttered a wail and began crying, big thick tears flowing down his face. "Mom," he sobbed. "Mama." She moaned and crawled for him, dirty stained nightgown bunching up around gray legs. Her mouth snapped open and closed as Miguel kept just out of reach of her grasping hands. "Mom," he said again, and the sound of it almost broke Buck's heart. He shifted the rifle to aim at her head. "No, man," Miguel begged. "That's my mom." "Not anymore," Buck told him. Miguel sobbed and stepped back again as she kept crawling. "Don't do it," he blubbered. "Don't do it, man." Buck cradled the rifle to his shoulder and squinted down the sights. His finger rested on the trigger. He could hear Miguel crying, and beyond him, his wife in the car as she sniffled tears too. Buck took a deep breath and lowered his weapon. "Come on," he told Miguel. He moved around the dead woman on the ground and gripped Miguel by the arm. He led him back to the passenger side of the car as the moaning remnant of his mother skittered and scratched on the ground after them. Buck seated Miguel, then moved back to the driver's side. Miguel reached for the shotgun in the floorboard and aimed it under his chin as Buck gripped the wheel. Then he opened the door, leaned out, and said goodbye to his mom. The shot woke up the little girl, who began crying in the back seat. Lucy rocked and comforted her, or tried to, as Miguel came back in and set the gun back in the front floorboard. His tears joined the girls and they cried as Buck drove away. Chapter 17. "How much gas do we have left?" Miguel asked a half hour later. "Half a tank," Buck said. They kept their voices low. Lucy had finally fallen asleep with the child in her lap, arms locked around each other for comfort and security. Buck kept the speed at 40 miles an hour, slow and steady, a relentless pace that he hoped would soothe an anguished Miguel too. "Gets good mileage," Miguel said. Buck almost asked him if he was all right, but he knew the answer. The answer was he wouldn't be. Probably not ever again. Even if the world went back to normal and the smart people working on a solution solved it, the man would have to live with the image of his mother for the rest of his life. No wonder he checked the end of the gun before turning it on her. "We can try to find more at the next station," Buck offered. "Some of these rural places have hand pumps, or we can try to fashion one to siphon it out." "Cars too," Miguel said. "We see a car on the side of the road, we stop to scavenge it too." Buck nodded in the growing gray light of dawn. "You tired?" Miguel asked. He nodded again. "Me too." They couldn't sleep yet though. First, they had to find someplace safe. A safe haven in this state of emergency. He just didn't know where that might be. Joint adventure.